What if the British Empire didn't really leave India in 1947? Not in the way we usually imagine, with flags lowered and ships sailing home, but in a quieter, more powerful form. What if the most enduring legacy of the Raj wasn't railways, courts, or bureaucracy, but debt? Here's the mystery. India became politically independent in 1947, yet for decades afterward, it kept paying for British wars, British imports, and British financial mistakes using its own money. Not through guns or governors, but through ledgers, interest rates, and obligations written in small print. This isn't a story about tanks and treaties. It's a story about accounting entries that outlived an empire. And once you see how it worked, you'll start noticing the same pattern repeating across the modern world. To understand how debt became Britain's final weapon in India, we need to rewind not to 1947, but to the late 1700s. When the British East India Company arrived, it didn't conquer India overnight, it financialized it first. The company was not a government. It was a corporation with shareholders in London. Its goal wasn't administration, it was extraction. And the most efficient way to extract wealth wasn't by looting cities, but by reorganizing India's economy around British needs. By the early 19th century, India had been transformed into a supplier of raw materials, a captive market for British manufactured goods, and crucially, a revenue machine that could be taxed to fund Britain's global ambitions after the 1857 revolt. The British Crown took direct control. The Raj was born. But the financial logic didn't change, it hardened. India would now serve as Britain's balance of payments stabilizer, its military piggy bank, and its silent creditor. This is where the story of imperial debt truly begins. The core mechanism was deceptively simple. India collected taxes from peasants, artisans, landowners, rupees, but Britain used those rupees to buy Indian goods without paying India in return. How? Through something called home charges. These were expenses Britain claimed India owed for the salaries and pensions of British officials, interest on railway investments owned by British investors, administrative costs decided in London, and military expenses often for wars fought outside India. India didn't approve these charges. India didn't negotiate them. India simply paid. Every year, millions of pounds flowed out of India as visible shipments of gold, but as accounting transfers that favored Britain's financial system. This created a structural drain. India exported real goods: cotton, jute, tea, wheat. Britain exported paper claims and obligations. Indian nationalists noticed early. Dadabhai Naoroji, one of the first Indian economists, called it the drain of wealth. He argued that India was being bled not by inefficiencies, but by design. But the most dangerous part of the system was still coming. Then came the World Wars. World War I transformed India from a colony into Britain's war financier. India supplied soldiers, food, raw materials, and industrial output. But Britain didn't pay in gold or dollars. Instead, it paid in IOUs. By World War II, this system reached an unprecedented scale. Britain was nearly bankrupt. Its foreign reserves were gone. The United States demanded hard currency for supplies, so Britain turned to India. India produced war goods: steel, textiles, arms, food on a massive scale. Britain recorded the costs not as payment, but as sterling balances. These were debts Britain owed India, denominated in pounds, held in London accounts. On paper, India was getting richer. In reality, it couldn't touch the money. The balances were non-convertible, restricted, controlled entirely by Britain. By 1945, Britain owed India over £1.3 billion, one of the largest debts in the world at the time. India had become Britain's largest creditor. But creditors usually have power. India didn't. Here's where the story takes a darker turn. Normally, when a country owes you money, you can demand repayment, convert it into usable currency, or leverage it politically. India could do none of these, because Britain wrote the rules. The sterling balances were frozen to protect Britain's fragile economy. India could only spend them on British goods, and only when Britain allowed it. This meant India couldn't use its own money to industrialize freely, couldn't import machinery from cheaper markets, couldn't invest on its own terms. Even worse, these balances became a tool of leverage during independence negotiation. And this is where political freedom collided with financial captivity. In 1947, India finally gained independence. But independence came with a bill. Britain agreed to release the sterling balances, slowly, very slowly, arguing that rapid repayment would collapse the British economy. India, facing partition, refugee crises, food shortages, and the task of nation-building, had little choice but to accept. But that Britain owed India became a negotiated liability, not a guaranteed right. Worse still, inflation eroded the value of the balances over time. What India eventually received was worth far less than what it had effectively loaned. In real terms, India paid for Britain's survival as a global power after the empire officially ended. And this is where the illusion of decolonization begins to crack. When Britain left India in 1947, it didn't walk away clean. It left behind something far more powerful than armies or administrators, a financial architecture designed to outlast empire. India was independent on paper, but economically it inherited shortages, obligations, and distortions created over nearly 2 centuries. Now comes the real question. If Britain's debt to India was finally settled, why did India remain poor, constrained, and dependent for decades afterward? To answer that, we need to follow the chain reaction. Because debt doesn't disappear when it's paid. It reshapes everything it touches. The moment independence arrived, India faced a brutal paradox. It was one of the poorest countries in the world, yet it had just financed one of the most expensive wars in human history. But the money was gone. Not stolen in a single dramatic act, but slowly neutralized through delayed repayment. Inflation, erosion, forced spending on British goods, and post-war financial constraints imposed by London. This meant India began its national life with empty foreign exchange reserves, minimal industrial capacity, a distorted trade structure, and a chronic shortage of capital. To build a modern nation, India needed machines, technology, and infrastructure. But because of the legacy of sterling restrictions and trade dependency, it lacked the currency flexibility to buy them freely. So India turned inward. India's post-independence economic model is often framed as a simple choice, capitalism versus socialism. But that framing misses the cause and effect. India didn't choose heavy state planning because it admired Soviet ideology. It chose it because global markets had already failed it. With limited access to capital and a deep distrust of foreign-controlled finance, leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru believed the only way forward was self-reliant state-led industrialization, import substitution, and tight control over foreign exchange. This was not theoretical economics. It was defensive economics shaped by the memory of how easily financial dependence could become political subordination. But there was a cost. The system India built to protect itself also slowed it down. Because capital was scarce, licenses replaced markets, bureaucracy replaced competition, protection replaced productivity. What's rarely acknowledged is why capital was scarce in the first place. Colonial extraction had prevented domestic capital accumulation, destroyed indigenous industries, redirected savings abroad, and trained India to export raw value and import finished goods. These weren't policy mistakes of the new state. They were structural scars. And then came the global debt cycle. By the 1960s and 70s, India needed foreign loans, not to fund luxury but to buy food during shortages, import oil, finance development projects. This marked a quiet transition. From imperial creditor to post-colonial debtor, the language changed. The power dynamic didn't. Loans now came with conditions, currency pressures, policy influence. By the 1991 balance of payments crisis, India was again cornered by foreign exchange shortages, echoing the very constraints imposed during the sterling era. The difference: this time, the creditors weren't London alone. They were global institutions. This is where the story stops being only about India. Because the mechanisms Britain pioneered, controlled convertibility, restricted balances, forced trade patterns, are now global norms. Today, countries export real goods, accumulate reserves in foreign currencies, and recycle their earnings into assets controlled elsewhere, just like India once did with sterling. The numbers are staggering. Developing countries collectively hold trillions in foreign reserves, often earning low returns while borrowing at higher rates for development, effectively financing wealthier economies. This isn't conspiracy, it's accounting. And India lived through the prototype. Even today, echoes remain. Persistent trade deficits, sensitivity to currency shocks, obsession with foreign exchange reserves, cautious approach to external debt. These are not signs of weakness. They are institutional memory. India learned at enormous cost that sovereignty without financial autonomy is fragile. The Raj didn't just take wealth, it taught a lesson written into policy. 3 clear takeaways. 1. Empire survives through systems, not soldiers. Britain's greatest imperial achievement wasn't territory, it was designing financial rules that worked even after it left. 2. Debt is a political weapon. Used subtly, debt doesn't conquer nations. It limits their choices. 3. Development starts with monetary freedom. Without control over currency, trade, and capital flows, independence remains incomplete. If colonialism no longer needs flags, if power now flows through spreadsheets, then how many nations today are free in name, but constrained in practice? And how many future historians will look back at our era and say, the empire never disappeared, it just learned to balance its books? If this story changed how you see history not as something buried, but as something still unfolding, then share this video. Because understanding debt is no longer optional, it's the difference between seeing power and being governed by it. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden systems shaping our world. And leave a comment with the one question this video left you asking. Because the past isn't behind us, it's still charging interest.